When we made our first film, Metal Headbangers Journey, the one big interview we didn't get was with Metallica.
Don't be making no more movies without us, okay? I was sitting there on the last one going, what the fuck?
The closest we got was we used the song Master Puppets as the closing song of the film. But when we did our second movie, Global Metal, I got an interview with Lars Ulrich and I went to Metallica HQ in San Rafael, California. But the mistake I made was the first question I asked him was, how'd you get into metal? And in typical Lars fashion, he gave an extremely detailed response. And so here it is, uncut. Hands are up.
Okay.
Are we speeding?
Yep.
Sounds speeding. Global Metal, Lars Ulrich interview, take one. Thank you for meeting with us and letting us sort of take residence in your room here.
Casa su casa. Thank you for coming.
Oh, we appreciate it.
I'm curious to know how you got into metal.
Oh, I got into metal? That hasn't been documented enough. You know, I mean, I think it goes back to this Deep Purple experience in 1973 in Copenhagen, Denmark, where my father was playing a professional tennis tournament in Copenhagen. He was a professional tennis player, and they were playing the tournament from Monday to Sunday at this place called KB Holland. And on Sunday night, the day before the tournament started, Deep Purple were playing. It was in February 1973. So all the tennis players basically got an invitation to come see Deep Purple at the same hall where the tennis tournament was going to be the next day. And my dad and a couple of the other tennis players went, and I got dragged along. I was 9 years old, and Deep Purple were, you know, just on the last couple of months with Gillan and Glover. Who Do We Think We Are had just come out, or was just coming out in the spring of '73. And it was like, wow, that's really cool. There was so much energy and power and the spectacle, and fucking Richie Blackmore standing there playing guitar with his boots and fucking throwing it in the air and the whole thing. I mean, I just never seen anything. And Ian Gillan screaming in Child in Time and Ian Pace and the whole thing. It was just, so I walked into a record store the next day and I asked them for whatever Deep Purple records they had, and they gave me Fireball. And that was the beginning of it. Then it sort of went on a different path for a couple of years as you gotta remember I was only 9 years old. The next year or two, it was a little bit more about some of the poppier stuff that was coming out of England, like Sweet and Slade and Alvin Stardust and, you know, some of that stuff. But still, Deep Purple was, still a pretty big thing for me. And Deep Purple would come to Denmark. The first show they ever played with David Coverdale was 9 months later in December of '73. That was in Copenhagen, and I was there. And then they came back again about a year later with Elf opening for them with Ronnie Dio. And that was on Blackmore's last run in February and March of '75, blah, blah, blah. But so it started, you know, Sweet and Slade and Status Quo and all that stuff. And then, you know, in '76, as everybody else, then I got into the Kiss experience for a year, to, you know, Black Sabbath and all that stuff. Rush maybe a little bit. There was a magazine there was a magazine in Germany called Pop, P-O-P, that had a lot of, every issue they had like an article on Status Quo or Deep Purple or Uriah Heep or, you know, that type of stuff. And then there was a magazine in Sweden called Poster that always had, like, you know, it was like the whole magazine, and then you could pull the whole magazine apart, and it was all posters. Yeah. And like in every issue had like the latest pictures of Kiss from America with all the fucking hoopla going, and Black Sabbath and all this, and so that was kind of all that stuff. And then of course came the punk thing, and then you know with the Pistols and the Ramones and all that, I got kind of a little more into that for, you know, 76, 77. Then AC/DC showed up, 77, you know. So AC/DC opened for Rainbow in 77, and then Thin Lizzy and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, you know, Judas Priest, 77, 78. And then, of course, the big thing in my life then was in the spring of 1980, when everything that happened in England reached Denmark, and Iron Maiden and Saxon and Diamond Head and Def Leppard and all that stuff. And then I was off to the races, and most of the rest of that has been documented way too often. But that was sort of, you know, and then, you know, like, they were always natural to me. They always felt like they were natural extensions of each other. You know, when the punk stuff came about, I thought that, you know, the first Ramones album was as heavy as anything else that had preceded it. I wasn't sort of super, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, I wasn't super, it's like, I could sit and listen to Rush, and then I could listen to the Ramones, and then I could listen to Kiss, and then I could listen to Uriah Heep. I mean, it wasn't, you know, it's like, it's one thing and then everything else sucks, or, you know, I thought the Pistols and the Ramones, you know, were as heavy as any of that other stuff. And there was always other things that were showing up on the radar. I mean, Bob Marley was very big in Denmark in those years also, and I'd sit around and listen to like Bob Marley records with my friends and stuff, and so there was, I mean, it wasn't just like, you know what I mean, and my dad, you know, was really into jazz music, and so there'd always be a lot of next level jazz music playing in his room and so on. So it was a pretty rich experience. But the cool thing about Denmark was that all these English bands would come there like all the time. I mean, in 76, 77, 78, Rainbow probably came to Denmark every 6 months. Thin Lizzy probably came to Denmark every 6 months. There was a lot of those bands that would just come like all the time. I mean, I probably saw Rainbow like 4 or 5 times in the span of like 3 years, and you know, sat outside the hotel. They all stayed at the same hotel, the Plaza Hotel next to the main train station, and I would sit out there, and I got everybody's autograph. I got Blackmore's autograph, Ronnie Dio, Phil Lynott. I mean, everybody. I'd sit out there, you know, and then they'd show up, and this little 10-year-old, 11-year-old blonde, snotty kid, you know, they couldn't say no. Well, I didn't give him the chance to say no. Just fucking be persistent, and it was cool. It was fun. It was a great rock environment. Also because it was a very safe place to grow up. So I could, you know, take the bus into town by myself. I didn't have to, it wasn't like I depended on my parents. I was pretty autonomous, kind of running around to the gigs by myself, going to the hotels and going to the record stores or on my bike or whatever. It wasn't sort of like, you can't go to a concert or whatever, because it was just like, it was a very safe place to grow up. And you didn't have to rely on your parents or whatever. You know, I had my paper route and made enough money to go to these gigs and buy the records and do it all. And it was like, I just did it by myself. I didn't share it with anyone, because none of the other kids, I mean, they had no idea. I'm sitting there talking about Robin Trower or whatever. I mean, they just looked at me like I came from another planet, you know. It was kind of cool.
Cool. Well, I know you've been asked that question a million times, so I appreciate you.
Always, yeah. Well, I feel like I'm finally talking to somebody who actually knows what I'm talking about. Yeah.